Welcome to our Discourse 1 lecture for week 8. This lecture is titled Innovation, Rethinking Old Ideas. In this lecture, we will cover the following topics. First, we will start with the definition of innovation before looking at different types of innovation. We will then ask the question, why is innovation important? These opening 3 sections will be the bulk of the lecture and should hopefully give you guys a good understanding of the nature and importance of innovation. And once we have covered these topics, we will problematize the notion a little bit. Firstly, looking at the value of innovation for innovation's sake. And then I'll also cover the approach of heuristics, which is an ancient solution for innovation in any practical field. I will also briefly touch on the mindset and the power of the mad scientist before introducing the idea of crisis, constraint, and limitations as vital stimuli to spark innovation. Okay, so let's get into it. First off, by the definition of innovation, and I'm sure you guys can all guess how I'll start this by looking at the etymology of the word, going to Etym Online, the online etymology dictionary. And we can see here that the word innovation comes from the mid-15th century, borrowed from late Latin innovatio, which basically means restoration or renewal. The past participle stem of innovare, to change, to renew, meaning a novel change, experimental variation, a new thing introduced in an established arrangement. So already by looking at the etymological roots, we can see this idea of newness, of novelty, as key to the definition of innovation. Innovation means to improve or to replace something. For example, a process, a product, or a service. And this is usually done by applying new processes, introducing new techniques, or establishing successful ideas to create new value. The creation of value is therefore a defining characteristic of innovation. We therefore see 2 main concepts that are necessary for innovation to be present. The one is newness or novelty, something fresh, and the other concept is value. So it needs to add value at some level. The Oslo Manual is a guideline for collecting, reporting, and using data on innovation. And this was first published in 1992 and basically serves as an international reference guide for collecting and using data on innovation. And according to them, innovation is defined as a new or improved product or process, or a combination thereof, that differs significantly from the unit's previous products or processes, and that has been made available to potential users in the form of a product or a service, or brought into use by the new unit in the form of a process. So we already have a kind of gist of what the definition of innovation is, but we'll see that there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different definitions for the word out there. So just getting to the root of what the term actually means can be challenging. There just isn't a clear consensus, at least in the industry application of the work, for what the correct definition is. So for practicality's sake, let's just settle on these terms new and creating value. But even these can be quite subjective terms. So in order to help us understand this term better, by means of interviews with practitioners in industry, the website Idea to Value has compiled quite an informative article on what innovation is. And here I've just included a selection of a few of these definitions provided by these experts. The first one by Baumgartner says that innovation is the implementation of creative ideas in order to generate value, usually through increased revenues, reduced costs, or both. So that's that typical definition that I think we can all settle on. But just some other ideas, you see that David Drew Boyd says that anything that is new, useful, and surprising. So he adds the element of surprise to innovation. For Pete Foley, it's a great idea executed brilliantly and communicated in a way that is both intuitive and fully celebrates the magic of the initial concept. Whereas for Stephen Shapiro, innovation is simply staying relevant. And for George Barber, innovation is the future delivered. I'll provide a link to this article on Aero if you want to check out some of the other definitions provided by experts. But the conclusion of this article provides us with this ultimate definition of innovation, which is executing an idea which addresses a specific challenge and achieves value for both the company and the customer. And although these are very much definitions of innovation applied to industry or to business, it's important to note that innovation is something that can be applied to, for instance, school or day-to-day life, housekeeping, etc. But the sphere of innovation that is the most discussed is definitely business, commerce, and industry. And in this context, there are a few different types of innovation. Firstly, there is process improvement and organizational innovation, which is the improvement of processes through a gradual and continuous tinkering and improvement of the already existing solutions to develop new solutions. There's also innovation in the form of product development, where product features and innovative products are produced to create new items for consumers. There's also service innovation, which is the creation and introduction of new services for customers, users, and partners. And finally, there's the business model innovation, which is the development of innovative business models and revenue streams. The fourth and most recent 2018 edition of the Oslo Manual that I mentioned before gives a little bit of a different variation on the different types of innovation in business. The four they list is organizational innovation, process innovation, product innovation, and marketing innovation. So let's break these down. According to them, organizational innovation refers to the development of new organizational strategies that will somehow change an organization or a company's business practices, as well as the way its workplace is organized and its relationship with external stakeholders. So a good example of this would be some companies who started adopting a 4-day working week and saw their productivity rise by giving their workers an incentive to have a day off in the week. They actually were more productive, and in 4 days they produced more work than they would in 5 days. Also, the first companies that started to use the power of digital technology and allowed their employees to skip the office and work from home. Now, this has obviously produced mixed results, but in certain industries this has definitely proved more productive than forcing employees to come into the office. Process innovation is about the implementation of a new or improved production or delivery approach, including changes in operational methods or in the techniques used, and maybe even in the equipment, tools, or software that we make use of. And this, I would say, is a very good one that would be applicable to your practice. As a designer or artist, you can always consider using other mediums, going about your creative process differently, mixing it up. The best practical example here in contemporary society would be cryptocurrency and the way that coders have innovated with cutting-edge technology to create their own currency, a more peer-to-peer open source ledger. And within this space, we could look to the continent in Africa, where mobile pay systems like M-Pesa in Kenya and others are demonstrating the emergence of innovation in the internet-based smartphone interfaced technological reality that we live in today as our main medium of communication, visual communication and audio. And another interesting space where this innovation is happening is on the online art gallery scene. So NFTs would be non-fungible tokens, or basically unique artwork that cannot be traded or duplicated for anything else on the Ethereum blockchain. Ethereum, of course, being another cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, which is the most famous one. This whole space, this digital space for value creation, is probably the most cutting edge example I can think of contemporary innovation in our global information age culture. Then we also have product innovation, which is the introduction of new or improved goods or services. And these inventions or changes may have to do with improving the technical specs of products or the materials of the software, or even advancing the user experience platform. However, product innovations don't need to improve all the functions or performance specs. A slight improvement or even just an addition of a new function can also be merged with a loss of other functions or the downgrade of some other specifications. But the key thing is that product innovation must again add value to users, because just routine changes to software are not really considered innovations. It has to add some kind of value to the user experience. Some interesting examples of product innovations would be Lego, who changed the materials of their famous bricks to biodegradable oil-based plastics so that they are a more sustainable company. The first electric vehicles introduced into our modern car market were also an innovation, and new batteries with longer ranges that keep coming out are another example of innovation, because they are not just new inventions, but they actually add value to the experience of owning and driving an electric vehicle. Finally, the Oslo Manual of Innovation lists marketing innovation as the fourth crucial aspect of innovation in business. And this means developing a new marketing strategy that produces changes in, for instance, the way a product is designed or packaged, or even other decisions regarding price or promotion. And a great example of this would be Häagen-Dazs's new waste-free containers. The initial challenge for the company that owns Häagen-Dazs, Nestlé, was very much a practical one, where they wanted to retain the pack integrity and the product stability within the constraints of a new loop circular shopping platform, which they unveiled early in 2019. And the basic gist of this was that the packaging would need to survive at least 100 uses and be 100% recyclable at the end of its life. So this for them was an opportunity to think beyond sustainability, to create an even more premium expression of this luxury ice cream brand, the tub format, and the experience of the consumer. The double-walled pack means, for instance, that your hands stay warm while the ice cream itself is kept cool and doesn't melt. And these practical needs, along with the sustainability goals, allowed the brand users to retain a sense of emotional connection with their favorite ice cream. On this theme of sustainability, we should actually also add a fifth category to the four listed by Oslo in terms of innovation in business, and this would be eco-innovation, which follows from the UN Environment and the European Commission's sustainability goals. Eco-innovation is an innovation that results in significant progress towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals established by the UN. In practice, it basically means reducing the impacts of our production modes on the environment, improving nature's resilience to environmental stresses, or achieving a larger, efficient, and responsible use of natural resources. So a few examples of eco-innovation would be Procter & Gamble developing detergents that work with cold water washings to save households on electricity bills. The furniture brand IKEA started using a fleet of electric vehicles as part of their sustainable strategy. And a very well-known one would of course be paper-based straws, which have been developed as an alternative to plastic straws. So this is all good and well, but we should ask the question, why is innovation important? So organizations and businesses have several options to increase their competitiveness. They can strive for price leadership or develop a strategy of differentiation. But in both cases, to lower the price and to create a standout brand, innovation is crucial. And this is what we see especially in the tech industry, how many of the successful startups launch their activities by developing an innovative product or service. So continuous innovation is therefore crucial for any business in our contemporary marketplace. And although innovation has always been one of the driving forces in competition and has always been a primary competitive dimension, the numerous studies and publications of recent years show that the speed of change is increasing, which makes innovation one of the most important drivers to the long-term success of any business or company. Accordingly, methods of collaboration and teamwork are increasingly being used in numerous companies to promote digital innovations, to overcome the challenges of digital change, which is of course very relevant to businesses, companies, and practices which have existed before the information age and now need to transition into the digital age. We even see many companies completely pivoting to a different line of products in order to stay afloat. And the good news for all of you young creatives is that this increasing push for innovation in the contemporary marketplace has required a higher degree of creativity than just the day-to-day operations that we expect from a business. So now more than ever, innovation is crucial, not only in creative practice, but actually in all spheres of business and commerce, as well as sustainably managing our planet's resources. But should we just adopt innovation for innovation's sake? Remember, a key component of innovation's definition is that it should add value. So therefore, it's crucial to note that we shouldn't just innovate for the sake of it. And in keeping with this, there are actually many ancient solutions which are very much valid to this day. So therefore, in the quest for innovation or invention, we shouldn't always throw the baby out with the bathwater. Many ancient solutions are valid to this day. So I suspect some of you are very skeptical about my claim that I just made, but just to back it up and to illustrate it to you, I'll list a couple of inventions or ancient creations and technologies that we use to this day, including door locks, which comes from the age of the ancient Egyptians way back in 4000 BC. The Egyptians had a tumbler lock, which was 2 feet in length. Another big one is the second most consumed product to this day in the world, second only to water, and that is concrete. And although we might associate concrete with huge industrial buildings or modern highways, it was developed famously by the Romans 2000 years ago for construction. Another ancient invention that is very much in use to this day would be paper, something that hopefully you guys all employ in your creative practice, whether that be for drawing, planning, or for eventual printing. This was of course invented by the ancient Chinese. Other ancient inventions still in use today would include something like an odometer, which measures the distance traveled by a vehicle, as well as something like perfume, which has been in human cultural practice for at least 4,000 years. And this appreciation for ideas which have stood the proverbial and literal test of time can be described as the Lindy effect. So the Lindy effect was a term developed by the contemporary author and philosopher Nassim Taleb, and is named after a famous coffee shop in New York, which for native New Yorkers seemed to have been around forever. Actors who hung out there gossiping about other actors discovered that Broadway shows that lasted, say, 100 days had a future life expectancy of another 100. And for those that lasted 200 days, you could expect the show to run for another 200 days. So Taleb would call something Lindy when it has been around for a long time. So in the case of, say, concrete has been around for 2,000 years, so we could probably expect it to be around for another 2,000 years. So following this wisdom of Taleb, he would advise us definitely not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and really ask ourselves when we are coming up with new inventions, are we really adding value? Therefore, we should really strive towards innovation and not just invention or pure novelty. This Lindy effect theory, developed by Taleb, is what we call a heuristic. Now, if we look at the etymological roots of the word heuristic, you'll see that it traces from the meaning of serving to discover or find out, from the Greek word heuriskein, which means to find out, to discover, to devise, to invent, to get, to gain, to procure, and as a noun from the Greek word heuretikos, which means inventive, an invention, a discovery, or that which is found unexpectedly. And heuristics has for a very long time been a major tool of invention and innovation. It is basically a fancy term for the automatic strategies our brains use to cut down decision-making time without having to utilize energy. In effect, it is a way to work smarter and not harder, because often when we can experiment and play and discover things, we rather choose to do more research because we don't have enough information. Whereas in reality, we actually don't need to know everything about a specific subject, in order to experiment with it, to try out new ideas, and to work with it. If you think of something like Photoshop, you don't necessarily have to know every single functional tool in Photoshop to start playing with the tool. This is quite a complicated example, but if we take a simpler example, for instance, painting, yes, it helps to have instruction and training in painting to understand how to mix colors, to understand the behavior of paint. But in effect, you don't have to know the chemical properties of paint to make a painting. So heuristics is all about getting by with limited amount of knowledge. Just having certain principles to help your decision making, such as, for example, the Lindy principle. You don't have to understand the full history and all the details of a specific thing. If you just know that it's been around for a very long time, you can assume that it will still exist for quite a while to come. When it comes to experimentation, invention, and ultimately innovation, which, remember, adds value to inventions, heuristics can be a very powerful tool because it allows for us to work with almost like shorthand rules or principles without necessarily having to do a full course on a certain topic or to become an expert or to master a certain craft before engaging with it. And it's often our lack of knowledge or our lack of specialist knowledge which allows us to reach surprising conclusions, especially when we start using familiar items in unorthodox or unconventional ways. So in the case of organizational innovation and business innovation, there is actually a heuristic framework for innovation which deals with actually quite simple questions that you ask during the process. In other words, it doesn't need extensive R&D about every single aspect. When evaluating whether a certain trajectory or a certain project is being innovative, you could ask these simple heuristic questions, such as, does it fit the organization? Does it provide strategic advantage? Is there a demand for it? How might we pursue it? Is there a clear definition of success? And finally, which is quite important, will management or the funders support it? You can see from the flowchart then how this heuristic framework works, where these 6 high-level questions serve as the starters for your exploration of what's driving your innovation initiative. And this kind of approach, where we are not strict adherents to established protocols or not orthodox followers of theory in our creative endeavors, can be likened to the mindset of the stereotypical mad scientist figure in stories. Now, I know often the mad scientists are cast as villains or bad guys, introducing chaos into a plot or a story or a narrative. But I want you to consider some of the figures in contemporary society that we could liken to mad scientists. The best example probably today would be someone like Elon Musk, who very much lives with his heart on his sleeve and who a lot of people don't like because of his happy-go-lucky attitude and sometimes unconventional business decisions. But it is this kind of mindset, people like Elon Musk, show us that it is actually possible to break boundaries, to innovate, to go outside of the norm, to go against the grain, and to swim against the mainstream. And finally, in conclusion, I would just like to highlight that innovation is historically sparked by both crises and limitation or constraints. So a crisis forces people to see the world in a different way because it ruptures the assumptions on which everyday life proceeds and so creates a doorway into a different kind of world, one in which people can improvise solutions inspired by generosity and empathy, goodwill and common endeavor, resilience and resourcefulness, often lacking in normal times. And an obvious example that we can think of here is our current COVID-19 pandemic. Just think about how this crisis has actually forced a lot of people to innovate. And we could perhaps discuss this in touch if you consider how have you innovated in your day-to-day living habits due to the pandemic, due to the forced lockdowns or some other change in your everyday existence. And to elaborate on this aspect of innovation, I will link an article from the Harvard Business Review on Aero, wherein they discuss new research which suggests that managers can innovate better by embracing constraints. Through empirical studies on the effects of constraints on creativity and innovation, researchers found that individuals, teams, and organizations alike benefit from a healthy dose of constraints. It's only when the constraints become too high that they stifle creativity and innovation. And if you think about this, it's actually quite logical. It makes a lot of sense, because if you have literally no constraints, think of your creative process. If you could do anything, sometimes it's quite difficult to figure out what to do because there is no limitations. But as soon as you introduce some kind of constraint into your problem design or into your goals or into your means of achieving your goals, then suddenly you are forced to innovate. As they say in Afrikaans, 'n boer maak 'n plan. A farmer has to devise a plan, because if you're on a farm, isolated, in other words, constrained from all the luxuries and instant services that you find in a city, you have to come up with all sorts of ways to innovate and fix problems. Another good example is the street side mechanics that we find all over more rural parts of Africa, where they can basically fix any car with very limited means that they recycle and have salvaged. So the main takeaway from this is, don't let your access to resources or funding or anything like that be a hindrance to realizing your creative and other projects. Your constraints and limitations are actually the key to unlocking innovation. Great. So let's discuss this further in tutorials. Some of the questions that you can think about so long would be, for example, where do you think our society requires the most innovation? What areas of our current civilization needs updating, needs a bit of a refresh? And then also I want you to consider, what are some of the notable innovations that have emerged during your life? And specifically here also we can think of COVID-19. How have you recently been forced to innovate due to this global pandemic? What are some of the technologies and solutions that have been replaced over the years that you miss? So here I want you to think about where innovation has actually deprived us. So in other words, where it's maybe not innovation and where it's just invention for novelty's sake. Can you think of any technological devices or apps or any kind of day-to-day activities even that have been replaced by society's quest for newness, but which is not necessarily an innovation in the sense that it has added value to society? Then you should also consider how you can innovate in your creative practice. And I think the clue or hint here is in the last point I covered regarding limitation and constraints. Could there be some creative constraints that you actually deliberately introduce in your creative practice to unlock some innovation? And then you could also think about whether you are aware of any heuristics that you employ in your creative practice or that guide your decision making. And finally, whether you are willing to adopt the role of the mad scientist and turn against the flock, against the grain, and against the mainstream. Thanks for listening, and see you in tutorials.